Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to House. The ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela won control of the 277-seat National Assembly in legislative elections on Sunday. Socialist candidates are projected to win at least 189 of the 277 seats, after winning 68% of the vote, according to figures provided by the country's electoral authority. The election took place in the context of an ongoing effort by elements of the far-right opposition to oust President Nicolás Maduro from power through a series of increasingly desperate measures, including coup plots, assassination attempts, and claims to the presidency by opposition figure Juan Guaidó, who serves as the head of the outgoing legislature, elected in 2015. Today I'm joined by Raul Burbano. He is a Colombian and a community organizer in Toronto. He is the program director for Common Frontiers, a working group of labor and civil society organizations doing work on human rights and democracy across the Americas. Raul joins us from the Dominican Republic in transit on his way home to Canada after spending the week in Venezuela as part of an accredited election observation team from the US and Canada. Raul Burbano has observed elections in the region for 10 years and in over 5 countries. If people were to read an account of Sunday's vote in mainstream media, it would be safe to say that they would be left with the impression that the whole process was illegitimate and produced a fraudulent result. The New York Times even claimed that, quote, no major international organizations will monitor the vote, end quote, despite the presence of hundreds of monitors like our guest today. Raul, my first question, as a seasoned election observer, what were your impressions? Was the vote in Venezuela on Sunday free and fair?
Well, first, thank you very much, Jose Luis, for having me on the program. It's a pleasure. As you mentioned, I've been to Venezuela a couple of times and I've observed elections in 3 different scenarios in the 2010 elections, in the 2018 presidential elections, and these ones. And again, unquestionably, for the 3rd time, Venezuela has undertaken what would be considered by, under the United Nations Declaration on, criteria for free, fair elections, because they had sort of the 4 main kind of areas that I would consider is key, and so would the United Nations, which is they're universal elections, they're direct, they're secret, and of course they're free. Venezuela has a deep history of democratic participation over the last 20 years since Chavismo has taken power. Venezuela has undertaken, I think it's like 26 or 27 electoral process. So that has been, something that's been profoundly important for the Bolivarian revolution. We've seen that from Chavez to Maduro, which is very different from what, was the history of Venezuela with El Punto Fijo, for example, where in the past, prior to Chavez and Maduro, there was only about 2 or 3 political parties that shared power, which were the traditional parties. So, the beauty about these elections as well is that there was a plurality of political parties. There were 107 political parties participated. The bulk of them, close to 198 or something of them were, opposition to the PSUV or the incumbent. So it was really an interesting scenario because, I was able to speak with, representatives of the opposition for the Democratic Alliance, who had, their vision of what they were trying to get voters in Venezuela to support, which was, ironically, they wanted to go back to neoliberal policies while trying to keep, the social policies that were currently in place. I had the chance to speak with, the alternative revolutionary front, which is sort of split from the PSUV and created their own alliance. And they were talking about deepening the revolution. They were concerned that that the Maduro government had been moving closer to privatization around the economy. So there was definitely a plurality of political options in Venezuela, which has been the history, in my experience, at least in the last 20 some odd years.
So elements of the opposition, backed by the US and Canada and other members of the Lima Group, called for a boycott of the election. Nonetheless, this election saw 14,400 candidates from 107 political parties participate. And much of the attention that has been paid to this election has been precisely on the low turnout in the elections, with 30.5% turning out. The numbers are lower than what is usually seen in Venezuelan elections and democracy, but pretty much on par with the 25% turnout that we saw in the 2005 legislative elections, which also saw a boycott by the opposition. So you also had a chance to speak with Venezuelans that did not heed the call to boycott. What did they tell you about their decision to go and vote? Was there a noticeable difference in turnout between the rich and the poor areas that you were able to visit as an observer?
Absolutely. And I mean, there are sort of diverging views around whether it was really low in terms of participation. Yes, 30%, 31% sounds low, but it's not unique for National Assembly elections, which aren't the priority. Often people, I've heard, some news media comparing it to the 2018 presidential elections, and you can't compare them because people, they don't see National Assembly elections as priority. But yes, I mean, definitely feels low. And in my experience with talking to lots of people across Venezuela, from opposition members to supporters, there are many factors that influence the situation for elections. This year, and predominantly was obviously COVID has a humongous impact on the participation in any election. Although the CNE did a phenomenal job in terms of protocols and protections for whether elections observers or voters within the voting process. They rolled out. It was a pretty incredible feat to be able to do that during these elections. They also rolled out new electoral machines, which is obviously a very logistically difficult to do during a pandemic. But there are many factors that does impact participation. So, Venezuela is, suffering through a very deep economic crisis, predominantly due to the illegal U.S. sanctions, to the embargo, to the political interference of the United States and European nations and even Canada in order to make the economy scream. So, for example, on Sunday, we saw large lineups. There was very large lineups for people to get oil the day of elections, which obviously makes it difficult. You either focus on going to get some oil, or you go for elections, or you go for your food, which is important. So I think there are factors that have an impact. There is also something to be said around sort of electoral fatigue, as I mentioned. Venezuela has gone through more than 25 electoral processes over the last little bit. And although obviously it's important and critical, at least Chavismo doesn't see necessarily the elections as the most important scenario for fighting for political power. That's done on the ground. That's done on a daily basis. So elections are important in terms of, political scenarios. But, Chavismo and at least those who support the government, they see that the electoral process is fought on a day-to-day basis. The opposition, on the other hand, there was a sector, as you mentioned, Guaido and their supporters, who called for the boycott and are participated in their own sort of popular consultation. Nothing to do with popular, but that's what they call it. And so that has been the goal of the opposition, which is to try to push people not to participate in the elections in order to show that there's no legitimacy for the elections. But I think there are many factors that impact, as I mentioned, the electoral process, from economic to COVID to a consistent participation from many people in other scenarios in the political process, whether it's in comunas, whether it's in their communities, from that perspective.
So one of the implications of Sunday's result is that Guaido, recognized by a handful of countries as the president of Venezuela, by virtue of his place as the head of the outgoing assembly, he will emerge weakened. We've already seen reports that there are major divisions within the Venezuelan opposition, some of which you touched on. Whether it's fruitful to continue this U.S.-backed strategy of recognizing Guaido as the president, despite the fact that he wields no actual institutional power in the country. Another international observer with your delegation, Margaret Flowers, made an interesting observation on social media after meeting with the opposition in Venezuela, saying, quote, "One of the primary messages that they want us to convey to people in the United States is that the extreme right opposition of Juan Guaido is financed by the United States, does not have support in Venezuela. The extreme right is basically supported by wealthy Venezuelans who left the country. They want people to know that they represent the opposition in the country, and they want diplomacy with the U.S., an end to the economic war, and to have their sovereignty respected." End quote. Similarly, Grupo de Puebla, or Puebla Group, issued a statement today celebrating the elections and said, quote, that the democratic path is the best way to overcome the crisis in the country. We insist that the exit to the crisis must be accompanied by the end of the economic blockade that the United States government has imposed in a full pandemic. What does Sunday's result mean for the various currents within the Venezuelan opposition? And that I mean the group that follows Guaido, the group that follows Enrique Capriles, the groups that decided to participate in the election.
Mm-hmm. So I think for the groups that decided to participate in the elections, which is the Democratic Alliance, we met with them. I was in that meeting that you just mentioned, and they made it pretty clear that Juan Guaido, first of all, has almost very little support, according to them, not according to myself, in the country. The support for Guaido is really external. That's where his base is economically, funded by the U.S. and other sort of imperialist countries. So according to the members of the Democratic Alliance, who are opposition members and again do not support the government or the policies, they do not believe, and they're kind of tired that the Guaido camp, which is the more extremist camp, and we'll talk a little bit about them in a moment, have hijacked sort of the image, the points, of the opposition, and they have taken a stance. I think finally. And come out and said, look, we've broken with Juan Guaido. We don't want sanctions. I think sanctions and the impact that it's had on Venezuelans, more than 40,000 people have died. That was a few years back when the reports came out from the U.S. But there's a lot more people than that. I think they've realized that at least Venezuelans would not support an opposition that first is willing to call for sanctions on their own people because it hurts the average Venezuelan, and second, they would want to call for a military intervention into the country. So the Democratic Alliance have seemed to recognize that, have broken with the Guaido camp, and have realized that if they really want to help Venezuela, they have to work within the electoral process. It can't be done through support by the U.S. or trying to burn buildings down or try to disrupt their economy. They really want to participate, at least that's what it appears to at the moment, in the electoral process. They've taken, I think, a little bit less than one third of the National Assembly, so they can play potentially a role in the process, trying to push forward their electoral platform. In terms of groups like the Popular Revolutionary Alternative, which is led by the Communist Party and Tupac Amaru and some of the other the PPT and some of the other leftists, I guess they call themselves left to Chavismo, it has, I guess, left them a little bit probably wounded because they got a very low turnout, I think it was just a little bit over 2% that they received, which kind of shows that, their message, which is that the PSUV and the Gran Polo Patriótico aren't doing enough for the people. It isn't really resonating, that they are the only alternative to the left. Unfortunately, most Venezuelans don't support that. I remember being out on the street talking to people, and I would mention, what do you think of, the Popular, Revolutionary Alternative? And what I heard from most Venezuelans, to be honest, was who? Who are they? So they don't have that type of support. They definitely have some important critiques of the Maduro government, which I think the Maduro government should heed. The PSU should, engage more in them. There's been a bit of, I think it's starting to get a bit nasty in terms of accusations and, claims of interference, etc. So it is important that, the left come together, at least in Venezuela, to try to solve some of those issues. I think in terms of, more the extreme right, which is the Juan Guaido. With these elections, it has really, I guess, put a nail in the coffin of Guaido and his team, in terms of, any kind of legitimacy. They always had very little, and it was mainly an external. But I think now they're almost going to be non-existent, especially with the development of, the new left, the Democratic Alliance that is participating in the electoral process. So I suspect that either Guaido and his camp will start to fizzle out pretty soon. They've, as I mentioned, they're holding some kind of consultation, which, it'll be just it's more of a public relations act. And after that, with the change in the U.S., Biden coming in, there is a good possibility that little by little we'll see Guaido kind of disappear and fade as they try to reconfigure their next steps. And I think they're going to have to really decide if they want to continue on the path of destruction of the economy, of calling for invasion, and continue to be irrelevant, in at least in the Venezuelan scenario internally, or try to engage with some of the opposition that is now participating in the electoral process. Those are the kind of the big issues that I can see from the different currents that are taking place. But I think overall, what we've seen is that the large participation from the variety of political parties, as you mentioned, over 100, over 14,000 candidates, it's made it clear that, the message that, to participate in the political process, the official political process, the National Assembly, is where the change in Venezuela can take place, and it can't be done imposed from the outside. It can be imposed through violence, that type of stuff.
So obviously, for people like Guaido and his camp, the relationship with the United States is critical to what little power they actually do wield. And I saw that Elliot Abrams, who's Trump's special envoy concerning Venezuela, told Reuters in an interview that he didn't expect any major changes to U.S. policy when Joe Biden takes office on January 20th. And indeed, during the election, Biden's campaign often attacked Trump from the right for failing to oust Maduro. So what does the future hold for U.S.-Venezuelan relations in the context of the change in the U.S. administration? If we're saying that Guaido really doesn't have a lot of support inside the country, if he depends on foreign powers like the United States, Canada, the Lima Group, how important is this change in administration? What effect is it going to have on Venezuelan politics?
And that's a good question. I think it's really hard to speculate at this point, really what's that going to mean. Because unfortunately around Venezuela, in the U.S., the Democrats, the Republicans sort of have, both have kind of united on the vision of, that Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution is a threat to the U.S. It was under Obama that, some of the sanctions were started. But I do suspect that Biden will want to kind of sort of set his own path going forward. I don't think it's going to be radically different, but I do suspect, for example, that Guaido, which sort of represents kind of the Trump's stamp on the relations with Venezuela, will fizzle out in a little bit in the short term. What that'll look like in the long term is really hard to say, because I think it also really depends on the political situation in the U.S. The U.S. right now is embroiled in its own internal issues, whether it's around race, around the pandemic, around elections, and I think that Biden would probably do well to focus on healing and working internally than focus less on Venezuela. So I would suspect that it may, in the short term, give Venezuela, if anything, a breather in terms of trying to support their economy. And maybe less direct intervention, whether it's military intervention, as we've seen, the ratcheting up of the sanctions. So it should give Venezuela a bit of a breather, but I don't suspect we're going to see radical change in the policies from Biden, because I do suspect that Biden has to keep sort of the lobby, the Florida lobby, the Miami lobby, the sort of very hardcore right-wing Cuban Venezuelans who he didn't win. And he's going to have to probably give some type of, throw some bones at them kind of thing in order to keep them happy. So I suspect that in the short term, there is going to be a breathing room for Venezuela to be able to deal with some of their stuff. But I think in the long term, we're going to see, very little change in terms of actual foreign policy. And we'll just see a very different, it'll be different in terms of, Biden might pick his own opposition individuals who he's going to support. But I do expect sanctions will continue. And I do expect anything that can change the Venezuelan government from the U.S.'s point of view would be a positive thing. And they will do what they can with, sort of more of the right-wing conservative governments in Latin America, probably through Colombia. So I suspect that the proxy nations of the United States, like Colombia, Brazil at the moment, may play a bit more of a role. We saw, for example, that some of the observers who were leaving Venezuela to fly to Mexico, weren't able to, cross Colombian airspace, even though the Colombian government had the flight path months back, and it was very done at the last minute. So I suspect it'll be those type of things that would sort of try to continue to marginalize Venezuela on the international scene and make it very difficult to build solidarity with Venezuela. One of the key things that was critical in building support with Venezuela was delegations, international delegations from around the world who would travel to Venezuela, learn here, and develop sort of those symbiotic relationships. That will be, very difficult over the next little while, and I think that's part of the goal of sanctions. And the Biden, government will continue that pressure, at least from that perspective.
But still, we see that the international scenario continues to change, continues to evolve. After the retreat of the pink tide, which saw the return of right-wing and U.S.-friendly governments after ousting leftist governments throughout the region, there seems to be another pink tide. Mexico, where I live, is now governed by the leftist Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Lucho Arce won in Bolivia, which marked the end of a coup regime, a right-wing coup regime. In Chile, there was an uprising, and voters then pushed for this referendum, where they overwhelmingly opted to bury Pinochet's constitution. There were popular uprisings in neoliberal regimes like Ecuador, Guatemala, just a few weeks ago. Is this the beginning of the end of this sort of imperialist meddling by groups such as the Lima Group by the United States, this pressure that they used on their proxies like in Colombia?
I don't think it'll be the end of it, but definitely it'll become much more difficult for the United States to take such overt action because, as you mentioned, there's sort of some say that there's kind of a rejuvenation of pink tide countries across Latin America. So it makes it a lot more difficult for the United States to do sort of the overt Lima type group, as some of the Lima group members, like you mentioned, Ecuador, Argentina, Mexico, who in the past were, right in the camp of the United States, today, are either staying silent or not participating in those sort of forums. So yes, absolutely, it's definitely going to change it and force the United States to, I think, undertake some more direct pressure with its, strong allies. But I don't see an end to that. I mean, the countries of Latin America are very, very susceptible to U.S. pressure. We see it, for example, in the Caribbean, the CARICOM countries, who have been, by and large, very supportive of Venezuela, at least within the OAS. We see there is some cracking around that. Now, some of them are starting to either abstain around declarations of Venezuela or even support U.S. policy. So the U.S. is definitely, I think, going to start focusing probably more than not on pressure in the background on countries that are too supportive of Venezuela. And I mean, we see it with Cuba, for example. The tightening of sanctions on Cuba have made it very difficult. We know that Cuba is definitely not going to change its stand, but other countries who don't have that type of either political ideology or strength would easily kind of buckle under the pressure. So I'm thinking that from that perspective, that's what we'll see in change. But I don't see that, we're not in the pink tide, we're not in the early 2000s, where Brazil and all those countries were very supportive of Venezuela. Oil prices were really high. There's still going to continue to be a very difficult struggle for Venezuela, regionally and internationally, as we've seen the European Union, the United States, Canada. They've all, come out and condemned the elections as fraudulent. They've been planning this for a while. They've been calling these elections as fraudulent from the beginning, and that has been the goal: is to continue the delegitimization of the Maduro government and the electoral process, whether within the country, on the international level, and regionally. And maybe, there's going to be some nuances. Mexico is obviously not going to play that kind of role they've been playing in the past to support the U.S. But I do see that Colombia and Brazil then will become a much more important allies around the border, and ensuring that, the tightening of the sanctions continue to get stronger and tighter. And if there was any kind of diversion on that, then it would have been easier. So what it's going to focus, I think, more than regionally for Venezuela, I think the focus for Venezuela is going to be more, places like Tehran, China, and Russia. These are countries who have an ability to break U.S. blockade and are comfortable to feel the impacts of U.S. sanctions. There is a lot of investment I've seen in Venezuela while I've been visiting. They've taken us to a few places that have, foreign investment, whether it's Iranian, Chinese, or Russian. And so I believe that's where Venezuela is going to be focusing. Maduro was recently, I think it was in Iran, and we're signing more deals. Venezuela has passed a new anti-blockade law, which the focus is really about, investment in Venezuela. It has a lot of people criticize the law. There's a lot of issues about it, but really the goal for Venezuela has been, how can we enable investment in Venezuela? Because that is, the big problem right now for Venezuela, because the capital has dried up from the U.S. and other, regional countries who in the past would have done that. And so less, I would say, focus, I think, regionally, and more towards the countries that I was talking about from an economic perspective.
And so you're on your way back to Canada. Tell us a little bit more about what your delegation intends to do now that they're back in their countries of origin, be it United States, Canada, to try to affect change when it comes to the foreign policy of these countries towards Venezuela. Because as you described, this is a really critical element to the situation that Venezuelans are living in.
Absolutely. So I was in Venezuela with the Code Pink delegation from the U.S. So the majority of the participants were from the U.S. We've been working along with Code Pink and other partners, for a couple of years now, since 2018, on ending the sanctions against Venezuela. That's a key thing that we feel that we could, eventually put pressure on our governments to end the sanctions, and predominantly because the sanctions don't achieve what they're meant to achieve, which is regime change. What they do is they end up, ensuring that Venezuela can't bring in medical supplies, food, and the people who are hurt the most are average Venezuelans. So I think it's a pretty easy case to point to. The government said, look, sanctions aren't working. You were trying to do a regime change, it didn't work. So why don't you try something else? Whether it's engagement, whether it's dialogue. But clearly, sanctions aren't working. The elections are, I think, a perfect example. The Canadian government and the U.S. government, I'm sure, would have expected a lot higher uh, absenteeism. There was, for example, when I was walking around in Venezuela and talking to people, I mean, Venezuelans are hugely politicized and they understand the situation. And the first thing they tell you about is sort of the criminal economic embargo that the U.S. has on them. So Venezuelans are conscious of what's going on, and I think the more that we can do to end the sanctions. Canada has sanctions. Obviously, the U.S. sanctions are the most impactful, is a key component, and it would be a sort of a political victory in terms of ensuring that Canada, at least from a Canadian perspective, that follows an independent policy towards Venezuela. Because over the last 4 years, we've seen, unfortunately, the Canadian foreign policy in Latin America has followed lockstep with U.S. Trump foreign policy, which is a huge disappointment for most people. That's not to say that Canadian foreign policy is focused on human rights and other issues. Obviously, Canada is a country that's focused on its economic interests, mining, resource extraction in other countries, and in of its own, it's an imperialist nation. But I think at times, like we've seen in Venezuela, it can diverge from the Trump or from the U.S. foreign policy, and we hope that through that we can kind of bring some change around that. Really, what we're asking for and pushing our governments to do is to engage in dialogue, right? Really, that's the key thing. End the sanctions, and do like you would do with any other country, and be consistent around other countries like Honduras, for example, where there's a political economic crisis. The Canadian government, the first thing they say is we have to engage, we have to support, we have to invest in the country. Yet they want to do the opposite in Venezuela, which shows you that it's much more political than it is anything else. And we're hoping that when we get back, so the first thing we'll do is put together a report around our findings of the election. I suspect that that'll be, in contradiction to, most of the statements from the international community that have condemned the elections. And then second, we'll continue around, education and highlighting what's really going on in Venezuela, and then finally working around how we can end the sanctions.
So my last question, I always like to bring in people who are watching and asking us questions. Does this spell positive change for Venezuela? Do Venezuelans feel a little bit more optimistic about what the future holds for them? Is there a sense that perhaps there will be some relief from these crippling sanctions and that Venezuela can be free to pursue its independent course of development as they have chosen in these elections?
Absolutely. I think for the Chavistas, the ones that I've met, they were, for them, this was a positive sign. The people are still, firmly behind the government plans and their policies. Venezuelans understand where the majority of the issues are. I'm not trying to say that the government, doesn't face challenges and have made mistakes, and many of the Venezuelans know that. But I think many people that I talked to in Venezuela were clear that a lot of the issues, I mean, we could argue what percentage are due to the sanctions and the external pressure. So I saw a lot of enthusiasm from at least the Chavistas in terms of the political project has a mandate once again from the people to move forward and to deepen the Bolivarian revolution. But there are other visions, right? So talking to other parties, from whether it's from the left, like the Popular Revolutionary Alternative, which I think we should keep in perspective, are much smaller, but they do present and provide some concerning issues around how in Venezuelans, in Maduro and the government's desperation to attract capital, it could potentially undo some of the benefits of the revolution, right? So when you focus too much on private capital, then you have to give flexibility to labor, for example. You have to undermine environmental laws. These are some of the key issues that some of the opposition, the Popular Revolutionary Alternative put forward, and I think they have to be taken serious, and those concerns have to be addressed. On the other hand, the fact that the opposition alternative, like the Democratic Alliance, which is the more sort of mainstream opposition, from their perspective, they were very enthused that now they're going to be part of the political process. And I mean, they made it pretty clear they felt that they had been hijacked, by Guaido and their camp, so that they've kind of been rejuvenated. They've come together in I guess sort of a pact. They're now in the legislature, and they can kind of put forward their vision for the country, changes based on what they view. So I think overall, with taking into account how difficult the economic situation, the polarization in Venezuela, I think these elections signal once again that the Venezuelan people, by and large, are behind the Bolivarian process. There is struggles that they realize they have to overcome, and there are different ways of overcoming those, and that national debate will continue. And I think that now that the National Assembly is back, and it's one of the issues that we had in the past, is that there was a sort of a conflict because the National Assembly wasn't